My name is Miranda Anderson, and I'm doing my presentation on the First Crusade for History 101 with Professor Maniatis. What is a crusade? A crusade is any of the military expeditions undertaken by Christian powers to win the Holy Land from the Muslims, according to the Merriam-Webster Dictionary. The First Crusade began in 1095 AD and ended in 1102 AD. Christian forces wanted to recapture Jerusalem, also known as the Holy Land, from Muslim control. The Crusaders eventually conquered the Holy Land and established settlements there. Here's a map of the route that the Crusaders took. They began in parts of Europe and ended in Jerusalem. Who was involved? A variety of Christians from Western Europe fighting against Muslims. Alexius Comnenus was the emperor of the Byzantine Empire and needed assistance. The Seljuks, Turkish Muslims, had taken Byzantine control in Asia Minor, and Comnenus wanted to win back the territory. He needed mercenaries, so he asked Pope Urban II for help. And there's a map of the Byzantine Empire. At the Council of Clermont in France, November 27, 1095, Pope Urban II gave a speech. He said that Muslim infidels had desecrated the Holy Land, and that it was their duty to reclaim it. They made it sound like the crusade was just a holy mission and wasn't just about territory. He used the phrase Deus vult, which means God wills it. The people didn't know much about Muslims and didn't know that they worshipped the same God as them. Pope Urban II also appointed officials to preach for him and sent letters to nobles asking them to fight. The Pope offered plenary indulgence, which is forgiveness of minor sins, for any man who attempted the crusade. If they did so, penance would not be necessary, and they would be able to get to heaven. The people also knew of the benefits of the spoils of war. According to the Christian Bible, Jerusalem flowed with milk and honey and was covered in jewels. The people thought that they could get some of that profit for themselves. Part of the peasants' motivation for joining the crusade was that they would be able to get into heaven and have eternal life after they died. They also lived very difficult and stressful lives, so they really had nothing to lose by joining the crusade. Part of knights and nobles' motivations for joining the crusade was that they felt a duty to serve the church. They were also interested in monetary profit and the promise of plenary indulgence. A peasant preacher known as Peter the Hermit gave speeches that inspired thousands of peasants to join the crusade. The group of peasants became known as the Peasants' or People's Crusade. They began in France and went through Germany, picking up more peasants along the way. A knight named Sir Walter Sansevoire also joined and helped to lead the group. The members of the Peasants' Crusade made some crucial mistakes. They brought no supplies because they had mistakenly believed that the townspeople along the way would hear of their mission and provide them with food. To keep themselves alive, the peasants were forced to steal, and they targeted Jewish populations several times. In 1096, the peasants reached Constantinople. Comnenus warned them that without weapons, the Seljuks would quickly destroy them. Peter wanted to wait for the armed knights to catch up before they moved on. The peasants wanted to go on towards Jerusalem anyway. Eventually, the Emperor of Constantinople forced them to leave, as they had stolen and attacked the outskirts of Constantinople. Peter decided to stay, and Sir Walter Sansevoire led the peasants on. They were defeated by October 1096. While the peasants were doing their thing, wealthy nobles were getting ready to go on the crusade. They had to settle things with their fiefs to make sure that their land would still belong to them once they returned. Nobles from all over Europe joined the effort. There wasn't a central authority to guide the whole force because each noble had their own knights that were loyal to them. The three strongest nobles became the overall leaders. Bohemond of Taranto was from Italy. The other two, Raymond of Toulouse and Godfrey of Bouillon, both came from France. The Crusaders reached Constantinople by April 1097. They camped outside the city and waited for the other groups of Crusaders to show up. Comnenus made the nobles take an oath of loyalty to him before they could go on. He saw them as just mercenaries. The men were upset, as they believed that they were fighting for Christ, not Comnenus. Comnenus was forced to revise the oath to convince Raymond of Toulouse to take it. The Crusaders marched toward the city of Nicaea. The Seljuk Sultan, Kilij Arslan, was unprepared and Nicaea fell. The Crusaders wanted to sack the city, but they had already agreed to leave it intact for Comnenus. As the Crusaders were on their way to the next city they planned to attack, Antioch, Kilij Arslan was following behind to attempt revenge against them. He and his army eventually caught up, but another Crusader army wasn't far behind, so his forces were forced to retreat. On their way to Antioch, the Crusaders were exposed to barrenness and heat, and it was difficult for them to get food and water. By October, the Crusaders reached Antioch. There was a very difficult winter, and some resorted to cannibalism in order to survive. Several abandoned the oath that they took and returned home. In May 1098, Pharos, a captain inside the city, let them invade the city in exchange for payment. They stormed Antioch and plundered it. Caraboga, ruler of Mosul, Mesopotamia, and his armies showed up to the city not long after the Crusaders had begun occupying the city. In May 1098, he trapped them inside before they were able to stock up on food and water. A Crusader named Peter Bartholomew claimed he had a vision, that the lance that had pierced Jesus Christ's side at the time of his crucifixion was buried in Antioch. They all dug around and eventually found a rusty lance, which they believed was the Holy Lance. They were so inspired by the discovery of the lance that they were able to destroy the blockade and forced Caraboga's army to retreat. The Crusaders did face some problems amongst themselves, including an epidemic disease and disputes over leadership. And while the Crusaders were in Antioch, control over Jerusalem changed. The Fatimid Muslims from Egypt attacked Seljuks and conquered Jerusalem. Bohemond decided to stay and rule Antioch. Raymond was chosen to be commander-in-chief and led the army toward Jerusalem. The Crusaders captured several more cities along the way fairly easily. In June, they reached Jerusalem and began the siege. Heat and scarce food and water made it difficult for them. But Peter the Hermit gave a speech that inspired the Crusaders and raised their spirits. The Crusaders succeeded. They killed everyone living in the city, including men, women, and children, Muslims, Jews, and Coptic Christians. They plundered, taking valuable metals and stones from churches and mosques. They were successful in their mission of reclaiming Jerusalem, but Pope Urban II died before he was able to hear the news. It was decided that either Godfrey or Raymond would end up ruling the city. Godfrey claimed he couldn't be king because Christ was the true king, and because of his false modesty, he was declared king. Some Crusaders returned home, and some nobles stayed so they could rule over their new lands. The crimes committed by the Crusaders show that they were clearly not solely motivated by religion. They ruthlessly murdered many innocents and stole from people. They were more motivated by their own personal gain rather than some holy cause. Then, for the next 500 years, popes and kings declared wars against Muslims to keep holdings in the East. I was really surprised when I learned what the First Crusade actually was. I didn't know much about it before, but I'd always assumed it was some sort of epic religious battle, because that's what it sounded like. Now I know that it was not a respectable event. Some of the Crusaders genuinely thought they were doing God's work, but overall the crusade was just a bunch of people murdering a bunch of innocents and taking everything they had, but disguising it as a religious thing.